about our operation inside Russia, which has seriously weakened their military. Operation Spiderweb showed that modern war really looks like.
Said this operation that attacked 5 Russian air bases, 2 of which got some pretty significant hits on their bomber fleets, was to seriously weaken Russia. Do you agree with that?
No, Russia has not been seriously weakened by any of these. These are PR stunts facilitated by superior American military intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance via the CIA and MI6 to the Ukrainians. People have no idea how large these areas are. I keep trying to tell people, imagine if we were trying to fight a war between Chicago and Philadelphia. That's what you're dealing with in Ukraine. And that's what you've got when you start to look at the borders and the thousands of miles of border that you can't possibly protect 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You're going to experience these kinds of things. But as far as seriously weakening or damaging the Russian military machine or war effort, they're delusional. It's nonsense. I think we need to back up and understand something. Zelensky and Netanyahu are 2 sides of the same coin. What do each of those people want to achieve? They want to achieve the introduction of American military power into their respective conflicts. And that's important to understand. Zelensky's not stupid. He knows the Europeans have very little to offer. He knows they don't have much in the way of deployable combat power. You know, we've talked about their boutique ground forces or Lilliputian armies before. So he's hoping that the United States air and naval power, combined with whatever else we're prepared to send that we've got sitting in Poland, Romania, Lithuania, will turn everything in his favor. Therefore, everything he does is designed to persuade Donald Trump and Washington that there is still life in the Zelensky regime, that they could actually do something. You have something similar with Netanyahu. Both men are trying to stake out ground that make an agreement impossible. Just as Netanyahu has now made it very clear once again to Donald Trump, who has obediently replied and said, yes, you're right. There can be no enrichment in Ukraine. Well, that's the path to war, and that's the path that Netanyahu wants. And you've got something very similar with this man, Zelensky. We're going to fight to the bitter end. There will be no compromise. We will never admit the loss of any territory. So we're going to continue to lie about what we cannot do and pretend that we can do things by capitalizing on the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance we get from the United States, primarily in Britain. And we're going to use whatever they give us in terms of technology or advice to hit points that the Russians can't possibly protect 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So I think that's what we're up against right now. These are 2 leaders who don't represent the interests of the United States or the West in any way, shape, or form. And they're both interested in themselves and what they want to achieve. They're both delusional.
When the lead delegate for the Ukraine side came out and he laid out their positions, if you didn't know anything, if you'd been in a coma for the last 4 years, you suddenly woke up and saw this video, you would think, wow, if the Russia and Ukraine side are in a war, clearly the Ukraine side is winning because this is like the superior talking to an inferior.
We've been telling Russia for a very long time, this war must end. And the whole world supports us in that. We're calling for real work to end this war. The first necessary steps are clear to everyone: a ceasefire, humanitarian actions, and preparation for a leaders' meeting. If Russia is serious about ending the war, it will move forward on this. If not, international sanctions must follow.
So, yeah, then again, it repeated the issue. Sanctions, that's what they want. Whose sanctions? Of course, the ones from the United States. But then this issue of a ceasefire first, the leaders meeting, and all, ad infinitum on down the list. Things that they know categorically Russia has no interest in. So really, you can't read it any other way. Because if you haven't been in a coma, then you're looking at that and you're going, like you said a second ago, this guy's got to be delusional. So, but let me ask you, is it delusional or is it just a gamble that, well, we're going to try and pull Trump in? Because if they don't succeed, then these kinds of comments here, well, they won't play well over time.
Well, let's talk about 2 things that address your immediate question. I think the first thing is that very few people have paid attention to the resignation of the commander of Ukrainian ground forces. And he was widely viewed on the Russian side as one of the few competent people serving in the Ukrainian military. And he resigned, and they made up some reasons for it. But what I'm told is that he's frustrated because he has been continually ignored. He's given good advice. He's recommended certain courses of action. They've always been rejected. And now he's pointed out that the front is crumbling and the future is clear, the complete annihilation of Ukrainian forces on the ground in Ukraine. That's what he says they're headed for. Now, that was not published, and that's not the sort of thing that anybody in Washington is going to admit to. But I think that's much more important than anything else we've heard. There's something else here, and this is something that you can appreciate in particular. I think we all can that have been involved in the disasters, military disasters of the last 30 years in the U.S. military, or I guess it's 34 now. And that is something that General David Petraeus said while he was on the ground in Iraq. And he repeated this to several people, and people seemed to think this was a brilliant insight. I thought it was a disgraceful comment and an admission of deceit. But, you know, in retrospect, he turned out to be pretty correct. And he said, what happens on the ground here, meaning Iraq, doesn't really matter. What's important is what people in Washington think. Now, that's what you're dealing with right now. You're dealing with perception, creation, shaping, and implementation. In other words, we're going to create the illusion that there's something left inside Ukraine and in Kiev. We're going to be assisted in this by the Western media, who simply repeat ad nauseum, you know, the MI6, CIA mantras to convince everybody that there's something happening here which isn't. We're going to have these PR stunts, and we're bringing over two senators. Richard Blumenthal, as I recollect, he was someone who claimed to have served in Vietnam, and then it turned out that that was not the case. And then, of course, his comrade in arms, the combat lawyer from South Carolina, and the two of them showed up and charged an enormous hotel bill, hundreds of thousands of dollars. I don't know what they were buying over there, but don't even want to think about it. But having said all of that, all of this is designed to create a perception that there's something happening that really isn't. And I think that insofar as the average American is concerned, who can't really discern what's true and what isn't because it's so confusing, they may have had some success. But the truth is, it's a failure.
And you know, you talk about Gary. I don't know if we have this B-roll here. We talked about earlier today, but you talk about the stunts and things to get media attention. There was overnight another provocation by the Ukraine side against Russia on an emotionally important that they know issue on the Crimean Bridge, where apparently one of the support structures was attacked from underneath. And it's unknown exactly the extent of the damage here, but that's something that the Ukraine side has been talking about attacking for years. They've been trying to bring it down. Yeah, that's the one right there. Thanks, Gary. And so we don't know the nature of this damage, but something was done underneath it. And this is something that is an emotional issue. But as I understand it, and I don't know what you can shed light on this, that because of the first iterations where they tried to bring down the bridge and actually did blow up with a suicide bomber on it, portion of it in the past, that Russia now doesn't use it as much. They rely on other means to support their troops on the Crimean side. What does this tell you about the situation here?
Well, it doesn't add any more to what I've already said. This is another stunt. Again, people need to ask the question. Some people have. Does this in any way, shape, or form change the reality on the ground in Ukraine? The answer is no, obviously not. I would even go so far as to point out that the bombers that they damaged were very old aircraft that were due to be retired in any case. They've used them for the purposes of delivering these glide bombs that we know about, but they're not entirely dependent upon just those aircraft for that capability by any means. So again, this is just a ridiculous PR stunt designed to create the illusion on the model of Dave Petraeus. We're trying to shape perception in Washington, in London, in Paris, in Berlin, that something's happening that really isn't. Now, having said all of that, there's another question that has to be asked, and that is, where is President Trump? Because remember, one of the things that happened as a result of the attack on the bombers is essentially a violation of the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks Agreement. That was the agreement where we said we would display our bombers on the tarmac. The Russians said they'd display theirs. So there's no question in anybody's mind about where the bombers are and whether or not they're armed or not armed with nuclear weapons and so forth. Well, we've just destroyed that tenet. That's being taken very seriously in Russia, by the way, very, very seriously. And we don't seem to understand that. The gravity of that particular action in Russia is viewed with great fear and anger, because the Russians have been frustrated with our readiness to essentially throw all the arms limitations agreements out of the window. Now, that appeals to the Netanyahu, Zelensky, warmongering crowd in Washington. But it's a dangerous thing that we as Americans ought to object to. But I don't hear anybody raising any objections to that either. What the bottom line is, where is President Trump? What is he doing? Where is his influence? And I think we need to answer that question.
You know, that's obviously there's a lot of people waiting for that. He's been surprisingly quiet, even on the issue of the attack on the airfields, et cetera. There was a lot of questions that have been asked here just last night, actually, from Caroline Leavitt. The press corps was pressing her on these issues, and she literally wouldn't even answer. Didn't say anything about what he thought one way or the other. I don't know if that just means they're consulting, they're thinking about it, they don't know how to answer. I'm unclear, but it's one of the rare times where I've seen Trump go silent. Someone who's not silent, though, is the Russian side. If Zelensky thought that the attack on the airfield would cause Putin to quake in his boots and make them to be forced into peace, didn't look like there was any evidence of it with the Russian leader of the delegation, Medinsky, because they published a 12-point plan that came out afterwards. And that's I think it's probably more accurate to say these are terms of surrender. Just running through them real quick for those who can't read that small print. Apologize for that. The Russians basically say there will be permanent Ukrainian neutrality. There will be the termination of all international agreements, i.e. no NATO. Legal guarantees that Ukraine will remain a non-nuclear state. Strict limits on the size, structure, and armament of the military, i.e. demilitarization. Full protection of rights, freedoms of official language and status for the Russian-speaking population, something going back to the Minsk agreements, which Russia has demanded. Legislative bans on what Russia characterizes as glorification of Nazism, the denazification, removal of Western economic sanctions since the start of the war, and on down the list. All of this basically going to say, you will do everything that we say, or and let me just throw this up there. This was the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, Nebenzia, who, if anybody had any doubts at all about the significance of these statements, he cleared it up.
As long as Kyiv tries to prolong the war and provoke Russia by striking residential and civilian infrastructure on our territory, we will continue our special military operation and destroy objects associated with the military potential of the Kyiv regime. And no new anti-Russian sanctions, arms supplies to Ukraine, or other hostile steps towards Russia will prevent the inevitable military defeat of the Zelensky regime. The choice is now up to Ukraine. Peace as a result of negotiations or inevitable defeat on the battlefield with different conditions for ending the conflict.
So he just flat out said it. It's either negotiations or defeat. That doesn't sound like a state that feels like it's on the back foot or that it's under military pressure. Is that just posturing on the Russian side, or do you think it's a statement of fact?
No, I think the Russians are stating the facts as they see them. And that's not really directed at Zelensky. Let's be frank. Zelensky's irrelevant. Zelensky's a puppet. He is not a serious state leader by any stretch of the imagination. We know that. I mean, this is the man that has essentially treated Ukraine as a prison and treated anyone in it that didn't like him or didn't support his operations as a prisoner. Now, I think what you're hearing is a statement directed at President Trump, because the expectation in Moscow is that President Trump holds the key to ending the war, and he does. Now, and this is why I brought up President Trump before. If we can say anything about President Trump to this point, it's that he has utterly and completely failed to impose his will on his own administration. Now, what do I mean by that? This is the man that said that he was going to make some phone calls and would end all of this in 24 hours. Well, we found out, and he's found out, that sloganeering and posturing is not a strategy. Sorry, President Trump, but promising to call somebody is not a strategy. he has no strategy. And at this point, he's lost all credibility because in his discussions with Putin on the phone or discussions between his representatives and the Russians and Saudi Arabia have all come to nothing. These promises of a normalization in relations between the two countries and a restoration of some measure of civility in our relations, all of these have come to naught. Yet those are things that President Trump said he wanted. Those are things that President Trump said he supports. So what's gone wrong? Well, nobody pays any attention to President Trump inside his own administration. He's surrounded by people who have their own agendas, and I'm sure that they pacify him, but they're scurrying off in whatever direction they think is appropriate. And it may be that in their minds, they're trying to implement what he wants. But the truth is that there is no executive competence. In other words, there's no way, no method to do any of the things that President Trump talked about. He just can't do it. You know, and this is not news to President Putin. President Putin has pointed out on numerous occasions, I've dealt with several presidents in my lifetime. Remember, he's been there for 25 years, and he discovered something. Whatever the presidents wanted to do didn't happen because the federal bureaucracy, the other members of the federal government, the Senate and the House, they're the ones that are ultimately driving policy.